I'm going to do a quick intro and then let you all take it away. So welcome. This is FrontierSpace Gallery in Missoula, Montana's artTALK with Eleanor and Mark, who were here in July to install their show, Flexible Accumulation, which unfortunately during the pandemic, our gallery was not open to the public. So they took some photos of the install and then took it down and went home. But the show is up on our website, which is FrontierSpace.org. And you can see the whole show, read their statements. It's a really nice show. It's really fun. Love your use of different materials to make forms and shapes. Really, really appreciated it. And I'm so thankful that you still came down and put it up, even though we weren't really able to get anyone in there in the space. You were also the last show in our alley gallery that we'd had for 10 years before kind of getting pushed out because of raised rent prices and capitalism. But we are kind of fundraising right now for a new space. We're going to build a mobile gallery out of a trailer. And hopefully by early next year, we'll have a new space. And I mean, I'd love to have you all back if you ever have another show. I'd really love for people to be able to see it and see your work in person. But if anyone is able to support FrontierSpace, you can go to our website. We have a wonderful donor who has offered to quadruple match. So if anyone donates $5, they're going to donate $20. So that's my little plug for donations and PR style here at the beginning. But mostly, I just want to thank Mark and Eleanor for agreeing to talk and share their thoughts, ideas, and process here. And then afterwards, we're going to have a little Q&A where you can ask questions. So I'm going to toss it over to you two. Tell us what you want to tell us.
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction.
Yes, thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, we have to get our technology sorted here.
Yeah, let's go ahead and give me control before you even start. Not like,
yeah,
just so we don't have to fumble with it later. Okay.
It's all good. Okay. I have to take it back from you immediately.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm Eleanor. We decided that the way we're going to work this is that I'll present my work first. Mark will present his work next for a little bit. And then he's going to kick it into like sort of our conceptual background and like our thinking and planning for the show. And then I'll sort of pick it up again and talk more about the work that we actually installed for flexible accumulation in Montana. So hopefully this will be as seamless as it was when we practiced it a few hours ago. So I grew up in New York, about an hour north of New York City in the woods in this teeny tiny little town called Katona. And so growing up, me and my family, we sort of had like one foot in New York City and like the other foot in in the woods. And that has really shaped my artwork from, that point forward. So we grew up with these old photos hanging in the library that showed our town being moved in the late 1800s in order to build the reservoir for New York City. So this is a picture of like one of the famous houses in Katona being moved by like a horse and like rolling logs and just people, which I always found like really fascinating when I was a kid. And even today, what's cool about this is like when the water in the reservoir is low, you can still see these old foundations of old Katona, and it kind of feels like you're looking at like a skeleton in the ground, or like there's this very strong kind of eerie sense of like the history that's really embedded in the landscape there. And also the ways in which history and human actions are recorded in and on the landscape. And that's been a theme in my work that, inspires a lot of my work even today. So this is a piece called Echo that was actually the first sculpture that I made when I got to grad school at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, where I met Mark and we became friends. So at this point, I was really interested in systems of organization, specifically growth versus decay. and organic versus manufactured. And so this sculpture is a representation of my imposition of a digital system of this symmetrical dot pattern over the top of an organic system of the fallen tree. So this tree was about 30 feet long, and it took, I think it ended up being over like 1,500 of these like little dots that I needed to install. And so as I was working on the piece, I had to make these decisions about which system was going to dominate the other. And I really, this is sort of like a hippy-dippy thing to say, but I really came to think of it as a collaboration between myself and like this tree. And so to make the work, I ended up drilling out each of these holes with like a little paddle bit. And then I pushed in these plugs of foam that I had cut by a laser cutter. And so these are all actual material inclusions kind of pushed flat with the surface of the tree. And so at this point, this is a piece called Ghosts 4 through 7. So these are site-specific installations, but they live on now as photographs. So I was just beginning to think about nature and exploring what qualifies as natural by interposing these constructed elements on an organic backdrop or like a natural setting. I was also getting really interested in perception when working on this piece, about how we put our faith into this term of like seeing is believing, but in actuality, so much of our experience of reality is just incredibly subjective. So although this work looks digitally created, these are real sculptural elements that have been placed into like these locations and these landscapes. So this next piece is called Where There's Smoke, There's Fire. And when I made this sculpture, I really set out to create this dialogue between real and fake nature, or inside versus outside. And I was intending to translate the staging of my three-dimensional elements outside in an environment to a sculpture inside that functioned without that natural backdrop. And so the sculpture is a neon light in the shape of a smoke puff. It also includes some campfire logs that I bought at the grocery store, some mirrored acrylic pieces that I laser cut, and also this insane camouflage fabric quilt that I sewed in a classic like log cabin pattern. So some of the context for this piece is I was thinking about the commonality between neon signs and campfires to like gather people together, to draw people in, and about how they both function as signage, but one is for products and the other is for this experience of nature. And just as an aside for all you students and grad students out there, this project just got torn up in critique. It was like the hardest, saddest critique I had in all of grad school, but I always show this anyway.
It's always been one of my favorite pieces. I remember when you were working.
Nobody else liked it at all. So this piece was for an installation that I did at Colorado State University about a year ago when I was the visiting artist / artist in residence there. I don't actually know what my title is officially, but it's called Crisis Complex. And so the title Crisis Complex refers to the state of environmental crisis that I believe we're living in, and the complex part having this layered meaning, firstly as like a cluster of structures, but also a complex is in a kind of like psychological hang-up about something, or additionally as a net of like connected elements like the military industrial complex. So the major components of this piece include Miracle-Gro garden soil, some corn kernel animal feed, which includes up to like 50% GMO corn. That'll be important in a sec. An American flag made out of emergency blankets, and this like ominous black obelisk. And so for the installation part, I planted the animal feed in the Miracle-Gro, waited for it to sprout, and then sprayed these like new corn seedlings with Roundup to reveal the genetically modified seedlings that were resistant to the Roundup weed killer spray. It only kind of worked though, because the gallery was too cold for a couple nights. And so it really just sort of became this race of like, which plants died faster than others. But it was important to me in making this sculpture that all of the materials were manufactured, even the dirt in which those genetically modified seeds were planted. So again, thinking of this dichotomy of, or the spectrum of what qualifies as nature and what doesn't, how we're perceiving these materials as organic, dirt and corn kernels, when really they represent this really high level of technological and industrial abilities. So switching gears a little bit, Drawing is also a major component of my artistic practice. And so where the sculptures are material heavy and complex, my drawings are relatively simple, where I'll use India ink and a dip pen and a brush to create these, like, I call them super nerdy, but like hyper detailed landscape drawings. And so for the series, I got really inspired by the photos taken by the Mars rovers that were being sent back to Earth, and became really into this idea of depicting active landscapes that were at the same time devoid of life. And so that kind of carries forward into this next piece called Morning of the Magicians. And so unlike that last piece, which was based on a Mars rover photograph, this one is just entirely made up, but kind of borrowing from the themes of that Martian geology. So lately, I've been experimenting with more color in conjunction with these barren landscapes or these deserted landscapes to see if I can kind of have a stronger emotional impact on viewers with those colors in these scenes. And with these drawings, I really just like to convey the idea that landscapes have their own autonomy and life beyond what's brought to them by biological life, and also beyond what is brought to them by our experience as humans. And so the next few drawings, which are also my personal, are from an ongoing series called Ground Cover. So the organic subject matter in the background is based on reference photos that I take while I'm hiking. I'm really terrible to hike with because I'm always stopping to take pictures of rocks and sticks, which people don't like. And these drawings are smaller than the other ones that I just showed. So these are about 12 inches by 16 inches, whereas the other drawings are usually about 24 inches by 36 inches. So these also start out as those classic dip pen India ink drawings, but then I blast over them these saturated brushed gradients of color. And then on top of that, more airbrushing with these stencils to create these sort of confounding geometric shapes. This one is called Madame Blavatsky's Meadow. It's named after a famous occultist. And so with this drawing, it's my hope that they create a feeling of like reverberation, right? Or a sense of the discord between like the background setting and the color and the geometry that's unfolding over the top of the scene. So as the series evolved, I've been borrowing color palettes from like the more outrageous aspects of nature, like tropical birds or flowers or butterflies, even sunsets, but also being really careful to make sure that I'm choosing colors that seem unnatural or synthetic because they are so saturated. This one from, again, Ground Cover is called cannabinoids. I think that's how you would pronounce it. And I really think of these colored elements as representing a kind of digital intervention, because these are impossible shapes, like ones that, because of their dimensional confusion, could never exist in spatial reality as we understand and experience it. So it's my hope that these drawings in this series really represent a more contemporary version of the traditional nature culture clash. So I'm gonna hand it over to Mark.
Okay. So hopefully you'll see quite a bit of overlap between what Eleanor and I work on. So I also grew up in a really small town, an agricultural community in northern Illinois, and west of Chicago. And this is a picture of some teenagers, probably not even teenagers, who are detasseling. And that was my first job. I filled out my W-2 when I was 12 years old and got a job detasseling. And that's basically removing the certain parts of the pollinator to control pollination between plants. I grew up in DeKalb County, which is kind of known as corn country. If you've ever seen, I don't know, I think like restaurants make the pressed metal signs of like the flying ear of corn, that's DeKalb. But when I was a kid, I thought, the job kind of sucked, but I thought it was really cool because I felt like a piece of farm equipment or like a piece of machinery. And I know that's super dorky, so please don't judge me. But to me, that was immediately apparent and part of one of the lasting memories I have from it. Of course, we didn't have protective equipment like these kids, and definitely didn't have adult supervision like that. When I was in high school, in lieu of taking AP classes, I thought it would be smart to petition for every other day off, because we had AB scheduling, to work in this factory. And the factory made plastic electrical components. And I mostly scrubbed and swept the floors, but every once in a while they let me work on some of the big plastic injection molding machines that look a lot like the one in the picture. And specifically, this machine really changed my understanding of how the world around me works, how things get made, how things we buy in stores got there, and what it means when we take them home. And so this piece here, I think, is a good example of my interest in machinery, mass production, plastics. You're going to see a lot of plastics, and generally just sort of domesticity and how we create it every day. So this vase is made using a sacrificial glass mold that from shattered parts of 1-800 flowers type vases. But it also incorporates some vegetable tan leather, a metal kitchen mold, and then at the end, finally, I just dumped a bunch of plastic on it. So I was trying to condense a lot of different ideas about how we live into like a single object by approaching objects, forms, and processes from both sides of the commerce equation, which would be manufacturing and consumption. This interest in production and systems and materials brought me to things like cardboard and cheap foam. I think that those two materials in particular, cardboard and foam, are basically ubiquitous in our world, but yet mostly go unnoticed. And I would definitely refer to them as emblems of our time, particularly post-COVID, where everything is coming from Amazon or Chewy or some sort of online site because we can't get to the stores. And so this is basically, I've rendered a really rough-hewn cardboard form, like a vase, and then did a direct burnout into bronze. So taking this really kind of disposable paper material and making it into something that will ostensibly last forever. This project is another packing material turned bronze project. And these vases are made using expanded polystyrene, which EPS foam, which is what you find in like pretty much all styrofoam packaging. I'm sure you can recognize that texture. Just like these things are about 19 inches tall, which isn't terribly large, but they weigh like pretty much 1 million pounds or close to it, because again, I used a direct burnout method where the foam mold, the foam form positive stays intact through the molding process and then gets burned out later. So it's not a thin wall. It's actually, these are solid bronze. And that was important to me because I wanted each piece to be totally unique, but also I wanted that sort of disparity between the really heavy bronze, ancient bronze material and the lightweight nature of the foam as we recognize it. This is a later piece called patio umbrella base. And so you can probably guess what it is. It's the foam packaging for a patio umbrella base, I think from Target. It's made from EPS foam. And unlike the last pieces, which were sort of raw EPS foam, this is foam that I've diverted from the waste stream. And it's been coated with 24 karat gold leaf. And I work a lot with gold leaf, especially recently, because, and particularly 24 karat gold, pure gold, because it interests me that gilding is such an ancient craft that cultures have used to celebrate gods and governments and other sort of like extraordinary feats of our humanity. And it feels like just the right kind of inappropriately appropriate to coat these one-time use objects with gold. And the material that the one-time use object is made from will likely last like 10,000 years or something like that. So I've been taking this idea of foam, and I've been trying to push this sort of polished turd approach by glazing and gilding rigid insulation foam, otherwise known as XPS foam or extruded polystyrene. And this is a common foam used in the home building industry for insulation. And so this XPS foam has been glazed with an epoxy resin, another form of plastic, to give it that ultra glossy sort of candy coated shine. When I was thinking of this and trying to develop this work, I was thinking about the tarts at the French bakery with the fruit on it, and they put the glaze over it. And I always expect it to taste like heaven, and then I can die, and then I'm always let down, even though they're good. But that's what I was thinking about. And then the letters or the branding is covered in basically a hand formed clay, epoxy clay, another plastic, and then coated in 24 karat gold. And I think it's easy to categorize this kind of work as entirely critical of products and branding. And in a lot of ways, that's true. But when I was a kid, my dad was a carpenter, and we spent a lot of time at the hardware store and on job sites together. And these kinds of foam materials are as nostalgic for me as maybe like a fishing lure or a particular scent or a song or a fabric may be for a lot of other people. And so, yes, I'm poking fun at things, and I like to make some jokes in my work, but I'm also paying homage to the material itself and those experiences. This is a really simple proposal I made for an exhibition where I wanted to kind of expand on this idea of the glazed foam and do something much larger. And the idea was I wanted to use the guts of like a traditional home wall and create a freestanding object that could divide the space like a wall, but without all the baggage that comes with being relatively permanent, as walls tend to be. And so the final piece looked like this. And what I wanted to do is take the humble sort of service-oriented material, as I like to call it, the foam, and turn it into what I would refer to as a performative material out in the space. And I sort of exalt this material by glazing it and then adorning it with these 24 karat gilded epoxy clay worms all over it. And so this really sort of humble material now has like $1,000 worth of gold adorning it. And the title is Divider, and that title is intended to highlight the primary function of the object as I saw it, which was to separate, create, or delineate space, again, much like a wall. But these components can be arranged in almost any configuration that they would allow to accomplish different tasks, perhaps depending on the exhibition they might be in. Or at least for me, the idea that they can do that is important enough. And so I want to show you a couple things from a project I've been working on, another collaborative project. Collaboration is a big part of my practice. And so I've been working on a project with Dr. Damon Crockett, who is a data scientist at Yale University. And we've been doing this for a few years now. We've structured our investigation around Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which are food, water, shelter, and energy. So the base level of things that humans need to survive. And so for this particular project, we decided to focus on shelter. And as we thought that as a foundational component of the building or home building industry, rather, the 2x4 was a great sort of, mascot for that. And so it also seemed like an interesting object, which it starts as an organic thing, a tree, and then it gets cut down and processed through, whatever phases of development into these really modular components. And then once it's brought to the site, it gets put back together as like probably some unique thing, right? And so I took a full 8-foot 2x4 and I cut it into 188 slices, which was the smallest slices I could safely get on the saw. And then took high resolution photographs of each piece and sent them to Damon. So what you're looking at now is a rendering of each slice in succession in a GIF that's, showing basically a fly through of the 2x4. And so we wanted to reference this unique to modular thing I talked about with like the tree becoming the 2x4 in the work. And we were relying on Damon's expertise as a scientist. And we thought, well, what if we made a computer try to draw stuff with the lines in the 2x4 in the grain pattern? And so that's what we did. We used a supercomputer capable of machine learning combined with computer vision to analyze all the slices and then try to draw a grid. We gave it a grid to try to draw. So looked at the grid and said, probably, oh shit. And then tried to draw the grid using the grain patterns, which is, impossible. And of course, it was a spectacular failure. But that was a big part of plan, was that we wanted to force it to do something that we didn't think it could do. And it went through millions of options and selected the one that it thought was the closest to the grid. And we ended up with 7 unique relief prints. This is, you'll see on the left, that's one of them. And we made the relief prints directly from the 2x4 slices, the original 2x4 slices. And then we took those unique relief prints and made 7 monotypes in the form of a cyanotype, which is basically the same chemicals that are used in the blueprint, the building industry. That was a genius idea from our friend Johnny Plastini, who is present tonight. I want to thank him because he was the master printer for these prints. He really helped us a lot on that project. And so really quickly, another part of this exploration with Damon, we looked at agriculture, food, so food, agriculture, and we wanted to think about really sort of big moments when agriculture was, maybe changing the world. And so the Bronze Age really came up as this moment when we could have more sturdy implements, therefore we could attach larger animals to them and they would last longer. And so we could be more efficient in the field, which meant our populations could grow. And this moment's linked to the first recorded instance of climate change as impacted by humans. It also is a moment where, because bronze, the ingredients for bronze rarely exist in the same place in the earth, copper and tin. When bronze became this absolute must-have technology, our trade routes across the continents really swelled up, and there was this huge cultural exchange at the time. So basically, we took 600 objects from the historical record, examined their chemical composition, and across the 600 objects, there were 15 different metals present, or 15 different elements present, and we basically came up with a visual recipe for it. So each print is a visual recipe for the elements inside the object. So this Aegean one has a lot of metals in it because they were using pretty dirty bronze because they didn't have access to a lot of the bronze, or a lot of the high quality ingredients that other regions did. But China had actually was one of the few places that had tin and copper zinc plates, and they had very clean bronze. So this sort of visual disparity is made visual across 60 different prints. And so I'd like to move on to and start talking about the ideas for this show in particular, and how Eleanor and I started kind of putting our heads together and finding some common ground, and how the show at FrontierSpace, Flexible Accumulation, came about. So this is a photograph of a piece by the artist Agnes Dennis, titled Wheatfield, A Confrontation, which is cited from 1984, but actually she planted the wheat field in 1982 on the 92-acre Battery Park landfill in downtown New York, which is 1 block away from Wall Street and within sight of the Statue of Liberty. And she says the placement was a meaningful attack, quote, was a meaningful attack on the divide between the rich and the poor, between the pastoral and the technocratic, and was a statement on the ways in which people embrace progress. And we love this piece because Dennis is really highlighting the kind of tensions that exist within and around and surround landscape and land use. And that planting a wheat field on a landfill in New York City can be a subversive or even political act. And it shows that the landscape is not, in fact, a passive entity. And so when we're considering this idea of landscape as active rather than passive, I'm reminded of what we call logistical landscapes. And these are places where commerce, production, distribution, and all these types of things come together in really highly specialized designs that you can see in this photo here. This is where vast tracts of land and massive amounts of money, energy, and time are spent manipulating landscapes to serve global needs. And this actually is not too far from where I grew up in Joliet, Elwood, Illinois. And so these spaces, believe it or not, or I'm sure you would, of course, but you may not have thought about it, these are absolutely requisite for any semblance of what we might consider a modern lifestyle. We need these to get the products to us to live the lives that we live. And this isn't just a condition of what we might consider the built environment. Even our agricultural landscape is highly controlled, meticulously designed, and tightly monetized space. And so it needs to be this way to provide the yields that are required to sustain our population. And so oftentimes what we find is that multiple types of land use collide with one another. And here we have a Menards distribution facility in Plano, Illinois, which was in my high school conference, the Plano Reapers. And they had a big scary guy, but the actually Reapers, like, farming thing. And so this Menards distribution facility is directly adjacent to both a land tract or a housing tract and an agricultural field. And so while these are definitely what we might describe as like superhuman designs, much larger than ourselves in terms of their scale, there are also more subtle but equally vital ways in which we've manipulated our environment to provide or convey resources for ourselves. And so this food, water, power, sanitation, all these kind of things are part of the infrastructure, and contemporary lifestyles are completely dependent on them, and they often go mostly unnoticed. And a lot of these things come from water. And so here you see on the left, in 1870, the Greeley, which is a community in the northern Colorado, the Greeley number 3 irrigation ditch was built. And it was actually dug almost from the Rocky Mountains all the way out to Greeley. I think it was 26 or 30 miles, and they dug it in 2 months. They conscripted like every able-bodied male who could hold a stick and stab it at the ground to come and dig this, because they had moved out here, started this utopian community, and very quickly the community swelled and they were running out of water. And so they had to get water to the fields, to the people, to the houses. And interestingly, this ditch, this canal that was dug later, when Fort Collins farmers, which was were upstream in the canal, started siphoning water off this canal, this big legal battle ensued over who got the rights to the water. And in the end, Fort Collins lost and really won first rights to that water. And that lawsuit established what we know as contemporary water law in the country. So oftentimes these infrastructures can have huge implications for other things that you may not really think about in your everyday life, and they have long-lasting legacy effects. Another ubiquitous use of land use in Colorado is the fracking well. These things are, and I can't emphasize this enough, literally everywhere on the plains just east of the Rocky Mountains. They are as close as they can place them. It's a real patchwork. And to me, they look like these alien implants in an otherwise sort of agriculture or pastoral landscape. And but what's interesting is their essential equipment, like the trucks and the big tankers and the skid steers, they end up fleeing the roads, these otherwise remote areas. Those and trucks carrying housing supplies to build new homes for all the people moving to Colorado. So while these types of wells have helped reduce our, it's important to consider they have dire ecological impacts and can even be really dangerous to nearby homes. So here you see some fracking wells directly adjacent to what looks like a pretty much brand new community that just opened. And so we're seeing increasing overlap and even collision between different types of operational landscapes in daily life. So places where different types of land use interact and become flashpoints where the needs of industry, the needs of commerce, and the needs of homeowners become flashpoints for the conflict of those. And there's always concerns about accessibility to and the extraction of the resources for the industry, and how those things might come to conflict with the well-being of the people that have to live nearby, both air quality, water quality. We've recently had cases of wells that weren't properly capped after they were abandoned, and then homes nearby exploded. This has ended up in the citizens have voted for legislature on both sides of this issue. So it's very much a part of how we live our lives, and a part of the fabric of our community here. And so the American dream, right? The single family home, 2.5 kids, the car, garage, all that kind of stuff. And this is a plan or a digital rendering for a new home in Tinmouth, which the last image may have very well been taken there. But Tinmouth is a town in Colorado that has seen relatively explosive growth in the last decade. It's just east of I-25 and just east of, just part of the Front Range community, just east of the Colorado Rockies. And so its explosion means that you're seeing lots of houses like this. And it's probably, you could imagine being involved in a lot of these land use conflicts. And what's super interesting is that while this is a digital rendering or a plan and it's yet to be built, it's being listed as a real house you can buy. And this really kind of closes in on what Eleanor and I are interested in with a flexible accumulation. And so we like thinking about the American home as the final destination of the output from these operational landscapes I was talking about, or maybe even homes themselves are the product, right? And so we started, when we were thinking about the show, we started thinking about ideas about home, about domesticity, and how these can become sources of inspiration, right? And we thought about it both on the macro scale of like using traditional home building materials, like as a direct appropriation and using those in our work, but also on the more micro scale of imitating or maybe using household objects to make the work that is in the show. And so before we move on to the actual show itself, and Eleanor is going to take over that, I just want to read you this quote from a little piece of writing that Eleanor and I did that was part of the proposal for the show that sort of sums up our view on how landscape integrates with this show. And so without wasting any more time, flexible accumulation is another way of describing the process of globalization. In their paper Logistics Landscape, Charles Waldheim and Alan Berger described flexible accumulation as characterized by neoliberal economic policies, just-in-time production, formal labor arrangements, and increasingly global capital flows. The places at which these ideas and systems meet the ground are known as operational landscapes. These are active sites of production and transition that exist at the intersection of manufacturing, agriculture, commerce, and habitation. Operational landscapes are embedded in the promise of modernity and are a manifestation of the pluralistic structure of contemporary American life.
Nice. So I'm ceding back control of yeah, slideshow. Awesome. So this is our transition into flexible accumulation. So this is the work that sort of culminated from all of that thinking and planning. So this is a shot where this is our proof that we are very professional. And I have sort of a hide and seek thing. So can anybody find the coffee cup in this image? It's like Game of Thrones, right? Where there's some sort of anachronism in there. Anyway, so Mark and I have a lot of material overlap in our work, and we're really making work based on like adjacent themes. And so we wanted to collaborate on a show together. So we were really excited when we got the opportunity to install the show at FrontierSpace, because we'd been planning this collaboration for years, right? Having studio visits, making sketches, boring our spouses with lots of conversations about XPS foam and adhesives. And so many of our conversations ended up developing or sort of centering around this theme, again, of operational landscapes and the conceptual role that it plays within our two practices. So from there, the idea of a vessel became a useful way to incorporate the themes of land use, of shipping, production, within like an object or a form. And so obviously we had not anticipated the COVID pandemic, but like all artists, and I think everyone in general, it really forced us to shift our practices. So no access to a wood shop, right? Less access to materials in general, lots of canceled exhibitions, and also, like Amanda mentioned in the beginning, no formal like opening at FrontierSpace. So do you all locate that coffee cup yet?
It's right by my butt.
Yeah, it's right here. Okay. So this is our like, this is our polished.
He was put away.
Yeah, generally placed. So this is our like polished exhibition shot. And so knowing that we weren't going to have visitors like walking through the show allowed us to arrange our work a little bit differently than we would have otherwise. So instead of thinking about how a visitor would traverse the space or how visitors would sort of move around in the space, the secret is that we planned this whole exhibition so that it would photograph and document really well for a virtual opening and also to like provide quality documentation of the work since we knew that it wasn't going to be up for very long. So again, this is like our finished, polished installation shot of all of our work arranged in FrontierSpace. And so like any collaboration, we weren't really sure how our work was going to come together or like what kind of vibe it would have. We'd sort of seen objects like placed near each other in our studios, but we were both really confident in and like genuinely excited about each other's work and wanted to leave enough room to maintain, for each of us, to maintain our artistic practice and our artistic interests and also our voice. So we ended up deciding not to work together on individual pieces. And like Mark joked about like pushing the same board through the table saw, like one of us has one hand on each side. But instead we decided to keep some general concepts and materials in mind to make sculptures and elements that could be remixed and recombined to create different tableaus or assemblages depending on their arrangements. And so we came up with the idea of flexible accumulation and making work for the show based on operational landscapes, and again, using this idea of the vessel as a way to translate our thinking into sculptures. So in its most expanded definition, a vessel is really just a unit of containment. So the term vessel applies not only to its function as a container to hold and organize materials for distribution or storage, but it can also pertain to a parcel of land as a unit of containment according to the use and the function of that site. So the work combines materials that are common, mostly like foam, plywood, styrofoam packaging, drywall, paper mache, concrete, etc., with some more specialized materials like gold leaf, mirrored acrylic, and cast bronze. So some of the forms reflect shipping pallets, houseplants, cinder blocks, and gilded styrofoam packaging taken from the boxes of consumer goods. I'm actually going to back up one more. While other elements are kind of reminiscent of furniture or truck mirrors or paintings or even of debris sort of left behind after an interior remodeling project. We really wanted the work to be primarily floor-based, but also not reliant on those traditional white, like blank pedestals. And so like I mentioned, we arranged the work and tableaus according to a gridded layout as a reference to the often modular nature of vessels, but also so that this grid would serve as like an encompassing and overarching system of containment for like the rest of the work in the show and the whole show. So often when arranging these setups, it felt to me like we were kind of decorating our house or like getting ready for visitors, right? And we were sort of moving things really specifically where we'd have like a specific sort of reflection that we were looking for of like, you know, gold leaf in like the foil on the outside of a foam piece, or we were sort of micromanaging where to place like the inclusions on the wall, right? So we really tried to pay careful attention to how all the shapes, forms, and materials of individual works could be reinforced and also reiterated like throughout a setup. So in this one, we're sort of riffing from blue to blue, gold to gold, right? Sort of plywood to foam and back again. So this piece, I think is like one of the standout works in the show. Mark disagrees. And maybe you can speak to this better than I can, Mark, but
I think behind it on the right is the standout. That's yours. So.
Well, thanks. But yeah, Mark, he sort of like breezed through this process, but he's developing this really like super hyper detailed, very technical process of pouring resin over the foam to get the super hyper glossy, delicious looking finish. And I love that you described it as candy coated, because it reminds me, it is sort of like the outside coating of like an M&M or something. It's so shiny, and it's like the surface is so flat and very reflective and just very satisfying to look at. So I'm a little bit sad because I think that translates pretty well in the photo. But its sort of shiny surface almost made it difficult to photograph in some ways.
They're tough to photo for sure.
Yeah, you can see it more on the one in the wall in the back also. And so taking a detail shot from this piece, this is also, I love this photo for a couple different reasons, but I love how, like, as a detail shot, it sort of reflects the surroundings of the rest of the show. And it served as this really interesting, like, alternative point of view, like, as you're walking around the space. And so I almost wish that we had gotten a couple different angles of this one, but this is what we have of this detail shot of the mirror sort of reflecting a piece on the wall behind it. And so, like Mark mentioned, I think this is maybe my best contribution to the show. So this represents, it's a paper mache dead plant in a classic thank you for shopping bag. And so when I was working on this in my garage over the summer, my 9-year-old neighbor, Kenny, came over to like see if he could help, but he also wanted to talk about art. And so we actually ended up having this really great conversation in which he classified this piece as being a real fake model of a real dead thing, which I think is actually an excellent description of what this is and what's happening. So for me, this piece is really a statement kind of about the false promises of capitalism, or like the darker side of operational landscapes, right? Selling you a dead plant in a bag, but thanking you for shopping, and also how we often spend our money on these like essentially hollow objects. And so we also wanted to make some like wall-based pieces for the show. And so these also function as modular works that can be moved and like recontextualized depending on the space or depending on our intentions. And so I made these drywall drawings at the peak of the coronavirus lockdown in Colorado. So we were suddenly all adapting to a brand new life and really becoming attuned to our immediate surroundings as they suddenly became our entire world. So these ended up being really quiet pieces. The subject matter of these drawings reflects my home and the suburban surroundings that we live in here in Fort Collins, with a lot of depictions of like lawn chairs and cigarette butts and empty beer cans, an old cooler, a garden hose, backyard fences, etc. So essentially, these are representations of the products of operational landscapes within the domestic landscape. And so also interspersed with these across the wall, we had this kind of like constellation of Mark's like styrofoam and gold leaf. I've been calling them nuggets, but I don't know if that's a fair description.
The folder that I keep all the images in on my computer is called Guilt Nugs.
Yeah. So the gilt nugs kind of scattered across the wall. And I think they were really great because they added these little like pops of like abstract, super shiny forms. And to me, again, they kind of like twinkled like throughout this exhibition. So I think it was interesting to kind of play off like the quiet, loud scenario, right? Where I think in some ways Mark's pieces sort of pointed to the drywall drawings, and then they ended up developing this sort of interesting relationship together.
I think it's also cool that they're both super mundane things. Like that's just the styrofoam from a slow cooker, like a crock pot. And like they're, you know, just different treatments. And that's like a turned over plastic lawn chair. So they're really different treatments for super mundane, everyday things.
Mm-hmm. And that also sort of became a theme, is that we're kind of trying to elevate things that like are not exciting about domestic life.
That's my approach to my entire life. Elevating something that's not very exciting.
Well, so this piece, like you may have noticed the other sort of packing peanuts scattered throughout the exhibition. And so these are really my response to like Mark's use of styrofoam packaging in the show. And so this is one of the pieces that was most impacted by the COVID epidemic, or pandemic rather, because they were meant to be cast in bronze last spring. but obviously CSU shut down, and so the bronze pour was canceled. And so originally my intention was to like borrow Mark's move of like transferring these low packaging materials, like these styrofoam packing peanuts, into high art materials, bronze packing peanuts. But obviously that didn't really work. So instead I cast the packing peanuts in concrete. So now the work is sort of more about a transformation of function from like use to disuse. But I really enjoy how the little pile of them interacts with Mark's bronze tripod, which is another object that looks like it might be useful, although like no particular use for it like comes to mind. I really like that about the work.
Yeah, those little tripods were just like, what was the minimum amount of structure you could use to create a shelter, right? So three sticks leaning against each other. Obviously, no one could live in there. It's tiny, but that was the idea.
But to me, it also looks like a stand for like another piece, or yeah.
It'd be like the sexiest fruit bowl. You just had like one orange on it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like ultra bespoke. And so this last image that we have from the show, I was sort of referring to this as our homage to like sci-fi. The piece on the left is one of Mark's sculptures that I've been referring to as his spaceship, possibly because I'm like not sure what else to call it. Like it's definitely an art. It's definitely intentional. It definitely operates in a really interesting way. Makes sense with the other objects, but I find it really interesting and difficult to sort of classify within art language. Like I think this is one of those objects where if you're trying to critique it in grad school, right, the critique would kind of like slide off of it, right? And so we're pairing this with like my sort of dad joke about what happens if you make a pile of shipping pallets in a pyramid, and like the shipping pallets are shipping themselves, like so we made this sort of like ziggurat out of these increasingly smaller pallets, and then paired that with what is it, umbrella stand? I'm sorry, I forgot the title.
I forget it too. It's patio umbrella base.
Patio umbrella base, yeah. So sort of pairing that with the patio umbrella base to be this almost like sun shape in the background. And so I liked thinking about this as sort of like a riff or like a joke on sort of like a ruin, right? Or like one of those golden pyramids in the golden sun. So
this is where the aliens pray.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, Mark and I both really like space and Mars and nerdy stuff about that. So this is our last slide. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for coming tonight, and also to Amanda and FrontierSpace and University of Montana for having us and for letting us talk about our work and our sort of silly show. So we really appreciate being here, and also you giving the opportunity for us to kind of showcase our work, because coronavirus took that away. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for still sharing. I just want to say for myself, like I really liked like walking in while you were putting this show up. I grew up really poor in a farmhouse in Northwest Missouri, where we used things like milk crates for bookshelves. And I definitely had a piece of that Pink Panther foam in my bedroom that I used as a bulletin board. Like I would peg like magazine pages to it. So like that whole the whole exhibition was kind of like, oh yeah, we did that. Like, that was really our furniture in my house.
Yeah, you get it.
My first job also was detasseling corn.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it was I like using that as the opening slide because I think a lot of people have, and it's one of those things. You just did it. They just put a bunch of kids on a bus and drove them out into the field and said, "Now go do this."
Yeah, or they were
when you were going to get fired or what? They just, okay, your group's done. We have no more fields.
Yeah.
But,
here's a sharp object. Go dig beans. Like, so, there's no supervision. You just go.
A lot of that work is mechanized now, actually. So.
Yeah. I don't know. There's still people detasseling though. Always be detasseling. Does anyone have any questions real quick? Just like,
yeah, I have a question if I could ask one.
Go for it.
Okay. I just want to make sure that you all can hear me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I thought it was just like looking through all those images and listening to both of you talk about them got me just like so excited, and like I don't know, the ways in which like the space was utilized, I think is like really exciting and interesting, and to like see all those strange collections of objects talking to each other. I don't know, it was very compelling. And then I remember you saying that like something about the space, like that it was sort of meant to be at, like maybe like exist then as like this photograph or like image as like because it was like for this like virtual meeting. So I guess I'm just kind of interested in like if that wasn't an issue, or like if people could kind of come and like walk, you know, through a kind of space, what would your ideal space be for this work?
I haven't really thought about that.
I'll take this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was really great about FrontierSpace was that it was for us, I think, the perfect combination of like a little rough around the edges, but also like a little polished in some ways. And so I think that also played really well with the work, where you sort of had drywall like to an extent, and then underneath it was like some bizarre, you know, patchiness of like other building materials. And so I think for me, I would love to see our work in another sort of setting that was like a little bit rough around the edges, right? So maybe a little bit bigger, that would have been okay. And I think if we designed it for more people to sort of be walking through it, that we still would have used a similar approach, because I mean, you could walk through it and it would have worked for like 1 or 2 people. But I think in general, having a little bit more space sort of around each like distribution of objects would have been helpful. So maybe in the next iteration, we'll get like a really cool raw space or something. Like, I don't know if you agree, Mark, but I'd love it if there was like a pile of like weird debris and like broken glass in a corner. Like we could just use that. That would be perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I thought the space was pretty much perfect. I mean, I wouldn't change much about it. Maybe more space, but actually, given the conditions of the pandemic and everything, it was perfect. And we even taped out. Remember, in my studio, we taped out the space, like how big the space was, and started thinking about how much work we needed to bring. And you know, it ended up being, the show in a lot of ways was designed for what we brought, at least was for that space specifically. And I think if it's in a different space, it would probably be a different type of show. Not a different type of show, but it would be slightly different, have a different vibe.
How about a giant, like, styrofoam cooler?
Yeah, I actually have one, and when I get some money, I'm going to gild it.
I'm thinking like the entire gallery space, like a big white styrofoam gallery space that like opens up like a cooler, and then you walk in and it's like the works all in there. I do have a question about styrofoam though.
Yeah.
So, one thing that I think is interesting is there's this hybrid of really ancient materials and technologies, and then what appear to be somewhat futuristic materials and technologies. I'm thinking about the patio foam piece in relationship to like lunar landers, or like the Voyager spacecraft that is still floating out and potentially will be caught by the species that is our demise. So I think there's like these hints at the really ancient and the really futuristic. And to me, styrofoam in of itself is kind of in between those two nodes. It's something that, it's completely bizarre in the same way that corn is bizarre. Like I think like there's a relationship between corn and the styrofoam that could be interesting to investigate. Like, like a tomato kind of looks like a bell pepper, but like there's nothing really that looks like corn. And there's nothing that really looks like styrofoam. Like it's such a bizarre material. They both have this like intrinsic ancient futuristic quality, both the corn and the styrofoam. And I was just curious, and not to like probe or put you on the spot, but I'm curious about like when styrofoam was invented, like what year, like who invented it, what company, How did it change American lifestyles, kind of like American Industrial Revolution, or you know, how is it enabled us to do things like refrigeration or insulation? How has it improved our quality of life despite you know, the obvious environmental sustainability issues of, you know, it takes a really long time to degrade, all that kind of stuff? Like, is there a positive and a negative thinking about like an optimism for the future through this catalyst of the styrofoam, but also the negative, like both the positive and the negative in the same space is encapsulated in styrofoam, in my opinion?
I don't know about you guys, but I just Googled it. Styrofoam was invented in 1941, first used in Coast Guard life raft.
Yeah, I didn't know the exact date, but I was gonna say early 40s, late 30s, and definitely 20th century as a petroleum product. And I don't, you know, I know a lot of artists that deal with environmental issues or social issues often take a really polemic position. But Johnny, I appreciate your sensitivity to like all the facets of the material. I think it's far more interesting to consider it in that way. And I always describe my practice as observing these things rather than like drawing a line in the sand, being really aggressively polemic. And I totally agree. I think when I look at the foam, yeah, it's a lot of times it is trash or garbage, or yes, it has the environmental implications and all these types of things, but it's hugely instrumental in so many parts of how we live. And I mean, yeah, like you had even said something I think a lot of people don't think of, is refrigeration, moving meat around the country, moving things that are perishables. The history of refrigeration is actually, I'll venture to say, fascinating, and how it impacted the way we eat food and use stores like the grocery store and stuff like that, and our general nutrition and all that kind of stuff. And corn as well, as we know, high fructose corn syrup and all that stuff we don't need to talk about because everyone knows about it already. But when you were talking about corn and styrofoam, I was like, oh yeah, and they both have kernels.
That's exactly what I was thinking too. I was like, that's Johnny's connection, right? I was like, I see what he's seeing.
And it's ironic that the corn has like really organized kernels, and that the foam kernels are all weird and all over the place.
I know also, Johnny, you're a fan of The Botany of Desire, right? That book. Yeah, as am I. And so just thinking about the history of corn and like, sorry, we can nerd out about this for a long time. Maybe we should stop. But just that it's such a highly industrialized, like consumable item, right? In so many different facets. So
yeah, and I also, you know, you're talking about like the vessel, and I think it's very appropriate that the styrofoam comes from a shipping background. What was it, the Coast Guard? And I think the corn is a vessel, but then also thinking about like, you know, the material, if you're to work with, you know, like boat resin or like working with the idea of shipping in a historical aspect. Like I think there's this idea of, okay, the Amazon truck comes and delivers my groceries, but there's this whole rich history of like trade and economy due to like seafaring vessels, like wooden ships, and you know, the idea of you know, for better or worse, like globalization in that regard, in an era when you know, we didn't have phones or things like that. So yeah, I think like shipping, but then also like the materials that are used to build a ship could be interesting if you're working with like these industrial materials, and there's a relationship to history and futuristic speculations.
If you want to talk about like corn used to be much like very, very small, like around this size when it was first like native down in southern Mexico. And as people traded north, it had to keep getting larger because of the climate, to grow in colder climates. It took, if I'm remembering right, about 1,000 years for corn to keep evolving to grow here in the north. And then we've GMO'd it to be much larger too. If you ever look at like the multicolored corn, what we call Indian corn, decorative corn, it's much smaller. But originally corn was much tinier, and it's a grain. It's a sheath of wheat a sheath of wheat, really small, looks like a cob of corn. and to
One thing that'd be interesting too, Amanda, I didn't know that history of like the growing corn. Like, I'm just thinking of relationships to things that have shrunk. Like maybe let's see some sort of data visualization of how like, and I'm just thinking about this like overlapping like simple diagram of how maybe like cats have shrunk while corn has grown, like from saber-toothed cats to like domesticated house cats, and then like from, you know, tiny corn to large corn, and like there's this idea of humans being involved in both of those processes, like you know, influencing nature based on our consumption, but then also like influencing what bizarre species develop based on how, you know, we want them in our house, and you know, they're catching mice for us and keep us warm as little space heaters and stuff. But like, yeah, I think there's a seriousness to the work. There's a seriousness to the work, but I also think there's a really like comical aspect to the work in both of your cases. So I think you could continue with like the humorous aspect of some of the work. I mean, like just the fact that you're working with gold leaf on foam in general, you can't take that completely seriously. Like I think like there's like really important implications philosophically, but also I appreciate the kind of lighthearted aspects of it too. So you have that all in the same space. It seems more like a true humanistic approach to these synthetic materials. So you know, having that in the space makes it seem less clinical or robotic or just, you know, factual. I think there's a real kind of emotional or you know, humanistic response I get to the work, and I'd like to like gently walk around that space, you know, like despite not being able to. Like there are all these designated paths in the grocery store or you know, even on campus, like they tell us which way to walk down the halls. Like I think if you were to do a show that was limited in-person visitation, if you were to like guide the path, like that could be kind of interesting. Anyway.
So I have a
Yeah,
question.
whose turn it is to talk? It's like, who's going to talk now?
Yeah. Jason, go.
Well, first off, I just want to say how impressive the show is. It's actually really interesting to see kind of how you guys resonate with one another. It's very complimentary, and yeah, I've been a fan of both your works for a while, and I wish I could be there in person to see it. One of the things that I keep thinking about, you know, a lot as you guys are talking about this, and I come from a background where in my MFA we always had this guy named John Gill who always asked the weirdest questions, but they were always the most illuminating. So I'm going to try to do a John Gill here for you for a moment. And you know, I see a lot of like this like interesting commentary, you know, about what's manufactured and what's quote natural, and there's that kind of weird duality which I don't always agree with. But then I keep thinking further about like there's an anxiety. With the most interesting anxiety is the anxiety of how you're treating garbage material, like what people would call garbage materials in this space, and so what I start to think about is I think back to McLuhan when McLuhan would call say that human beings are the sexual reproduction organs of machines, right? If we're doing like speculative realities and speculative design and all this kind of stuff, in those speculative realities, do machines have an anxiety about the manufactured versus natural landscape, and what is that rooted in?
Well, I think we can start with an object-oriented ontology, right? So decentralizing, Jason, our human consciousness. And so if you consider it from that point, I think we also need to consider what machines want, right? Like quote unquote, like what is their goal, right? And so I don't know, I'm having trouble decentralizing my my consciousness from this argument to kind of figure out what machines want, but I don't think they would be alarmed because they don't have emotions, right? So that's my simple answer to your question. Maybe I'm sort of missing the gist of your question.
I mean, part of my question is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but part of it's also this question of like, we are products of the built environment. I mean, we would not be what we are without that built environment. And so much of our assumptions about the world have come through this kind of becoming cyborgs with technologies from as early as fire to working in stone and these other things. And so kind of the question is like, what is that source of that anxiety? Why do we have that anxiety? When I kind of posited with machines, machines being this other thing that could not have been born without us diddling with the natural world, right? It doesn't mean that there's like that value one or the other. But again, you're creating work that creates this wonderful tension that I think causes some problems in a good way between how one thinks about that. And so I guess I'm kind of just like poking the bear and hoping to get interesting responses. But also, I think it's also like a really interesting consideration as this work evolves, because I think it's asking all the right questions, and I'm interested in seeing what evolves from there once that manufactured and natural dualism starts to break apart almost rhizomatically to other concerns.
Yeah.
If I could just add on to that question before you respond, that provokes to me the question of like future cultures, the archaeological quest of figuring out like where these objects lie within the context of a greater culture. But go ahead. Sorry, Eleanor.
I mean, that's okay. I don't know if we can. It's funny. I was just reading, or I had my students read an essay by Hito Steyerl for our intermediate drawing class. And it was the one about, well, I had them read about the spam of the earth. And in that, she sort of like zooms out and takes this look of like, what would aliens think of like internet spam and like all of the images that are sort of like swirling around the internet. And Patrick, I think you're sort of asking like the materialist question of that, right? So like, what would aliens think if they sort of like zoomed out and like looked at all of like our debris and the stuff that they produce? And like, in a way, I think that that's a really important question. And it's something I think that Mark and I are not, and I maybe shouldn't speak to you, but in the way that I consider materials, right, sort of everything at this point is like man-made to lesser or greater extent. And so I think that it's interesting because we're also in a place now where we can sort of trace back the origin of a material, right? Like we can Google where styrofoam comes from and sort of find out the origin story of that material, or we can think back to like where corn comes from and how it comes from like wheat, right? But I think what's sort of missing from that alien perspective is like the context and the origination of those materials. And so I'm also trying to tie this back in with what Johnny said, because I think that was interesting and something that Mark and I were thinking about towards the beginning of our collaborations, is just the history of shipping. And we actually started with the idea of Roman amphora and how they were packed into these like ship holds, right? And Mark, you actually have the vessels right behind you in studio. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we talked about how they were like,
yeah,
the amphora couldn't stand up on their own, the way they were designed with these pointed bottoms so they could be stacked inside the hull of a ship most efficiently. And for whatever reason, we geeked out on that for a while, and then these things came about and we ended up editing them out of the show eventually. But I think about, I mean, I don't know if I'm directly responding to Patrick or Jason's question, but I think about the corn discussion. When we think about the corn, that's not a natural thing, right? That we exerted our influence over the biological thing in really specific ways to get it to do things that we needed it to do. Because that was actually, for whatever reason, more efficient likely than finding another resource. But then I think about, the idea that, we really kind of have this really anthrocentric view of our environment and the world around us. And I've heard it said that, actually humans are not the most successful species on the planet. Grass is. Because we have decided in order to survive, we have to set aside huge amounts of our land, huge amounts of our resources that we could use for ourselves to cultivate it. And it's cultivated everywhere. So it's spread across the entire Earth, and it's, you know, I think wheat actually is the most numerous organism on the planet. So I'm not like getting at any direct point, but what Jason and Patrick are asking, those are the kinds of things that keep me up at night, or wake me up early, as it were. And I think I don't know that they need answers. They're just really fascinating perspectives to take. And then specifically thinking about technology and machines, I mean, I would say you could make a very strong argument that the corn you're buying in the grocery store is technology. And so where's that difference, that line drawn? And actually during our graduates, we were talking about the biological machine of the body and then the mechanical machine of we were trying to determine what makes a thing a machine, and where's that line drawn? And, you know, talking about how, like, yeah, you can measure all the parts and all the components and then the metals that they're made up of in whatever machine, or plastics, whatever it is, and know exactly where they came from and all that. But you could do the same thing with a human body. You could measure all of our blood and all of our cells and all the different types of them. And so where does that distinction lie? And we never really arrived at anything, because it's an art seminar and that's not really the point, but we're just having fun.
Yeah, I like that mystery aspect. I had a good studio visit with Layla in reference to her work like last week about that.
Her work was the one that prompted the conversation, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah. It just thinking about where, you know, we were talking about computer technology, or where mathematics comes from in relation to the natural world and the celestial bodies and things like that. And then we started talking about, you know, bodies. And anyway, I'm interested in the mystery aspect of some of the works, and sort of the irony of like what was shipped in some of the containers. Like, I think of like archaeology as seeming like profoundly meaningful, but also meaningless. Like when we're collecting a vessel and, you know, they're studying it, and then it's like, oh, well, this was someone's chamber pot, you know, it's like not actually used for something profound other than like collecting our waste, our biological waste, and then it becomes waste itself. And I think of like with your patio furniture piece, if I had to speculate, it's like, oh, wow, maybe, okay, so Eleanor, I'm the alien looking down at the world, thinking about what that thing is. If you're trying to like extrapolate this profound meaning, it's like, oh, maybe it was meant to contain a government satellite or a dish to, you know, communicate across nations, blah, blah, blah. But no, it was just a you know, nice kind of piece of patio furniture. So there's this.
It wasn't even a nice piece.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting critique of just like museum culture or archaeology, or what do we focus our time on investigating? I mean, I think you know, there's a lot that we can find out about culture from you know, vessels. Like I'm thinking about culture in the sense of human beings, but then also like the cultures of yeasts or bacteria or things that are on those vessels. Like in that chamber pot scenario, like maybe the actual pot is not the important thing, but like the residue of what was in that pot, like indicating the food that the people ate, like you know, what diseases they had, that kind of thing can give you a real indication of like the culture of a people. So I think sometimes it's interesting to have the mystery there in the work. Like I don't know. I think there's a cataloging that I really recognize in the patio piece, or like I started to think of the mirror as like a reference to like 1950s cars, or you know, but then also I like that there's an element of mystery retained, where it's like it could not be that thing, or maybe we're just archaeologically accurate most of the time. So yeah, what is the archaeology of today, if we were to look from 100 years in the future back now, or like these things seem very archaeological to me from the perspective of civilization 1,000 years in the future.
When it comes to those the gilded foam pieces, I also like the fact that they, for some reason, and I can't quite explain it, but I'm fascinated by the way they represent space around the object, and like they're not an imprint. They're made that way. It's not like the object pushed against it to do that, but they have there's like an absence, right? But and there's this transition from when it gets gilded, it goes from an object with or of an absence to its own thing. It stands on its own now, and it is its own, has its own new life, and all these, and what I think what you're talking about, like these new ways of interpreting it, or maybe misinterpreting it, is equally valid. And I spend way too much time on YouTube watching PBS specials about early civilizations and pre-hominids and all that kind of stuff, and I love that kind of thinking about how we interpret. Really,
yeah. What things are we misinterpreting from the past that actually had, and how does meaning change over time surrounding an object as time progresses, and the culture that was, utilizing that object, or inhabiting that object with their soul or life, or whatever you want to call it. How does that change over time as another culture tries to interpret it? Like what we think is of great importance might have been something really mundane, and something that we think is really mundane might have been of great importance.
Well, that's your chamber pot, Johnny, because, we think of a chamber pot as being so mundane or inconsequential, but really that is a technology that transformed human culture. The idea of sewage and, this management of waste really allowed us to come to that other level. So we might not be right in our faces as far as like the impacts of those technologies, but in that distant view, I think that we can see that certain things do have those impacts. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
I think it was interesting too how earlier, Eleanor, you talked about how with like the plant in the grocery bag, I guess like consumer culture and how we're consuming like these hollow objects. And I was maybe curious if you could try to like unpack this idea of a hollow object.
I mean, I think of a hollow object. Oh man, sorry to get again nerdy with this, but there's the book that describes non-places, and I'm blanking on the author's name. Maybe you grad students or grad seminar people can remind me. But I think of a lot of the objects that we have as sort of like these hollow objects, like the the sort of upside down plastic chair that's depicted in one of those drywall drawings. Like that has essentially become like a meaningless object, right? Somebody bought it to sin, it broke, and now it just sort of like lives this hollow like existence where it's not functional, but it's still sort of around our backyard, right? I think of some other hollow objects as being like some interior decorations, right? Like signs where it's like home is where the wine is, right? That's like a totally hollow object, right? It doesn't really mean anything, doesn't function as an aesthetic piece. It's not that clever, right? So that to me, again, is something that we would spend money on and purchase and hang up for like a month or two and then sort of like kick in the trash, right? Wrapping paper is another sort of hollow object, right? We disguise other objects in paper to then sort of throw it out. So for me, I think they take on a couple of different formats, but there's a sort of idea of like disposability in relation to those objects, or also that they're like cheaply available and like widely produced. Right? I think in part is like what to me also constitutes a hollow object. And like maybe a not hollow object would be, well, for me, something like handmade that a friend made, right? That's sort of the opposite, or like the antithesis of like what I would consider a hollow object.
I have a quick comments. I think that a lot of things that you are talking about in all your artworks is, I felt like freeze some time, and since we talk a lot about history, and I have done this research that talking about diorama, and I feel like you are kind of presenting a postmodern diorama, but you cast or remake, you are not really, you try to freeze that time by using your own interpretation, and that's in fashion world they say that's a remake, so you utilize the same idea but you remake it and add your own ideas. So I think those mix and matches pretty interesting. And also I think, like, even though Mark say that you like to do a lot of the useless things, but I think that's because our life was composed by those useless objects, or even those tiny stuff. And I feel like really connected with, because a lot of my art space reflection also utilize a lot of things that seems to be wasted or not noticeable, but when you enlarge it, then it becomes really important. When you put it there, it becomes important. It's just like a diorama. Nothing until you put it into that plastic cube, then you started to think about its importance and how it weighs in the history or in our lives. So I think this is a very inspiring and interesting conversations through all your works.
Thanks, Claire. I love that idea. Mark, sorry.
I like the idea. No, I like the idea of the diorama, or the almost like a museum installation of, but in some way it's like there's a glitch in it. It's not just the raw objects like presented in some sort of unconditioned or unbiased way. They're the things that surround us really specifically, or placed in a very specific and manicured kind of context to do the things that you're saying, kind of highlight different aspects of how they interact with our lives or their importance in our lives. And that in some ways, that's related to what David was talking about with the idea of like what a hollow object is. And so I think in a lot of ways, yeah, the objects we have would be considered hollow objects. And by Eleanor's definition, which, obviously there's a lot of correct definitions, but I like the way she described it. We've turned the hollow objects into, even though they're pointing at them, into really meaningful or solid objects, which has a lot to do with, of course, labor and things like that. But that is its own seminar.
Our colleague Del Haro has a quote that I love. He talks about like trying to make a cup that has a larger interior space than an exterior space, which like of course can't physically actually happen, but like there's this poetic notion that like the inside of the cup and what it's holding can have more meaning, or can be larger than the outside of the cup. So I think if we're talking about hollow objects, like maybe the interior space of the vessel and what it contains can be larger in this like extrapolated notion of like the meaning, kind of in the same way that he talks about the cup. Yeah, I need to go have dinner, but great talk and everything. I enjoyed seeing the work, and I look forward to talking with you all over a beer or something more in depth. So have a good evening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah, maybe now's a good time to give everyone their evening back.
Yeah.
All right.
This is a good presentation.
What's that?
Oh, I say this is a good talk.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, it's a great conversation.
Yeah, I know. We actually should just get a beer, because I think most of us live in or near Fort Collins or are coming back to Fort Collins soon. So
People
but I would just wish that you can actually be in the gallery, because I think that will be really important, different, that if you can actually touch the object or like close see it, because that's a very different thing. Like the things I'm creating now originally was thinking about those texture that you can let people to feel, but now this is not possible. And I guess that would be our new Modern. Think about that, Mark. How can you cast that?
Yeah. I'm gonna, we'll figure that out over the beer.
Maybe you can cast a gloves or a mask.
Yes. I do have a student right now who's making a lot of students, I'm sure, are making mask related art.
Okay. Yeah. I'll see
okay,
you.
bye everybody. Thank you so much.
Take care, guys.
Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks again, Amanda, FrontierSpace.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Really appreciate it. It's been a really rewarding experience.
Yeah, this has been really nice.
Okay. Yeah, let us know when you get that traveling truck and you can drive that thing down to us this time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I did my postbac at CU Boulder. So actually very familiar with Fort Collins. I really like it there. I know both Dell and, you know, I think there's a visiting professor there who used to be in the studio right next to mine.
Oh, Ryan Caldwell.
Sabbatical, yeah, found him sabbatical replacement right now.
Mm-hmm.
His studio was through that wall last year.
Oh, cool. Yeah, he said he was going to be here tonight, but that didn't happen.
He used to be a former co-director of FrontierSpace, so.
Yeah, I was talking to him the other day. He mentioned that. So.
That's funny.